bonfire and sprang at him, quick as a cricket. Chronicler threw up his hands just as the black thing struck his face and chest. Its cold, hard legs scrabbled for a hold, and he felt bright stripes of pain across the backs of his arm. Staggering away, the scribe felt his heels snag on the rough ground, and he began to topple over backward, arms flailing wildly. As he fell, Chronicler caught one last glimpse of the circle of firelight. More of the black things were scuttling out of the dark, their feet beating a quick staccato rhythm against roots and rocks and leaves. On the other side of the fire, the man in the heavy cloak held his iron cudgel ready with both hands. He stood perfectly still, perfectly silent, waiting. Still falling backward with the dark thing on top of him, Chronicler felt a dull, dark explosion as the back of his head struck the stone wall behind him. The world slowed, turned blurry, then black. Chronicler opened his eyes to a confusing mass of dark shapes and firelight. His skull throbbed. There were several lines of bright, clear pain crossing the backs of his arms and a dull ache that pulled at his left side every time he drew in a breath. After a long moment of concentration, the world came into a blurry focus. The bundled man sat nearby. He was no longer wearing his gloves, and his heavy cloak hung off his body in loose tatters, but other than that, he seemed unscathed. His hood was up, hiding his face. "You're awake?" the man asked curiously. "That's good. You can never be sure with a head wound." The hood tilted a bit. "Can you talk? Do you know where you are?" "Yes," Chronicler said thickly. It seemed to take far too much effort to make a single word. "Even better. Now third time pays for all. Do you think you can stand up and lend me a hand? We need to burn and bury the bodies." Chronicler moved his head a bit and felt suddenly dizzy and nauseous. "What happened?" "I might have broken a couple of your ribs," the man said. "One of them was all over you. I didn't have a lot of options." He shrugged. "I'm sorry for whatever that's worth. I've already stitched up the cuts on your arms. They should heal up nicely." "They're gone?" The hood nodded once. "The Skryll don't retreat. They're like wasps from a hive. They keep attacking until they die." A horrified look spread over Chronicler's face. "There's a hive of these things?" "Dear God, no. There were just these 5. Still, we have to burn and bury them just to be sure. I already cut the wood we'll need, ash and rowan." Chronicler gave a laugh that sounded slightly hysterical. "Just like the children's song. Let me tell you what to do. Dig a pit that's 10 by 2, ash and elm and rowan too." "Yes, indeed," the bundled man said dryly. "You'd be surprised at the sorts of things hidden away in children's songs. But while I don't think we need to dig the entire 10 feet down, I wouldn't refuse a little help." He trailed off meaningfully. Chronicler moved one hand to feel the back of his head gingerly, then looked at his fingertips, surprised that they weren't covered in blood. "I think I'm fine," he said as he cautiously levered himself up onto one elbow and from there into a sitting position. "Is there any—" His eyes flickered, and he went limp, falling bonelessly backward. His head struck the ground, bounced once, and came to a rest tilted slightly to one side. Coat sat patiently for a few long moments, watching the unconscious man. When there was no movement other than the chest slowly rising and falling, he came stiffly to his feet and knelt at Chronicler's side. Coat lifted one eyelid, then the other, and grunted at what he saw, not seeming particularly surprised. "I don't suppose there's any chance of you waking up again?" he asked without much hope in his voice. He tapped Chronicler's pale cheek lightly. "No chance at—" A drop of blood spotted Chronicler's forehead, followed quickly by another. Coat straightened up so that he was no longer leaning over the unconscious man, and wiped the blood away as best he could, which wasn't very well, as his hands were covered in blood themselves. "Sorry," he said absently. He gave a deep sigh and pushed back his hood. His red hair was matted down against his head, and half his face was smeared with drying blood. Slowly, he began to peel away the tattered remains of his cloak. Underneath was a leather blacksmith's apron, wildly scored with cuts. He removed that as well, revealing a plain gray shirt of homespun. Both his shoulders and his left arm were dark and wet with blood. Coat fingered the buttons of his shirt for a moment, then decided against removing it. Climbing gingerly to his feet, he picked up the spade and slowly, painfully, began to dig. Chapter 5. Notes. It was well past midnight by the time Coat made it back to Nowar, with Chronicle's limp body slung across his lacerated shoulders. The town's houses and shops were dark and silent, but the Waystone Inn was full of light. Bast stood in the doorway, practically dancing with irritation. When he spotted the approaching figure, he rushed down the street, waving a piece of paper angrily. "A note? You sneak out and leave me a note?" he hissed angrily. "What am I, some dockside whore?" Coat turned around and shrugged Chronicler's limp body into Bast's arms. "I knew you would just argue with me, Bast." Bast held Chronicler easily in front of him. "It wasn't even a good note. If you are reading this, I am probably dead. What sort of note is that?" "You weren't supposed to find it till morning," Coat said tiredly as they began to walk down the street to the inn. Bast looked down at the man he was carrying, as if noticing him for the first time. "Who's this?" He shook him a little, eyeing him curiously before slinging him easily over one shoulder like a burlap sack. "Some unlucky sod who happened to be on the road at the wrong time," Coat said dismissively. "Don't shake him too much. His head might be on a little loose." "What the hell did you sneak off for anyway?" Bast demanded as they entered the inn. "If you're going to leave a note, it should at least tell me what—" Bast's eyes widened as he saw Coat in the light of the inn, pale and streaked with blood and dirt. "You can go ahead and worry if you want," Coat said dryly. "It's every bit as bad as it looks." "You went out hunting for them, didn't you?" Bast hissed, then his eyes widened. "No." "You kept a piece of the one Carter killed. I can't believe you. You lied to me. To me!" Coat sighed as he trudged up the stairs. "Are you upset by the lie, or the fact that you didn't catch me at it?" he asked as he began to climb. Bast spluttered. "I'm upset that you thought you couldn't trust me." They let their conversation lapse as they opened one of the many empty rooms on the second floor, undressed Chronicler, and tucked him snugly into bed. Coat left the man's satchel and travel sack on the floor nearby. Closing the door to the room behind him, Coat said, "I trust you, Bast, but I wanted you safe. I knew I could handle it." "I could have helped, Reshi." Bast's tone was injured. "You know I would have." "You can still help, Bast," Coat said as he made his way to his room and sat heavily on the edge of his narrow bed. "I need some stitching done." He began to unbutton his shirt. "I could do it myself, but the tops of my shoulders and back are hard to reach." "Nonsense, Reshi. I'll do it." Coat made a gesture to the door. "My supplies are down in the basement." Bast sniffed disdainfully. "I will use my own needles, thank you very much. Good, honest bone. None of your nasty, jagged iron things stabbing you like little slivers of hate." He shivered. "Stream and stone, it's frightening how primitive you people are." Bast bustled out of the room, leaving the door open behind him. Coat slowly removed his shirt, grimacing and sucking his breath through his teeth as the dried blood stuck and tugged against the wounds. His face went stoic again when Bast came back into the room with a basin of water and began to clean him off. As the dried blood was washed away, a wild scoring of long, straight cuts became clear. They gaped redly against the innkeeper's fair skin, as if he had been slashed with a barber's razor or a piece of broken glass. There were perhaps a dozen cuts in all, most of them on the tops of his shoulders, a few across his back and along his arms. One started on the top of his head and ran down his scalp to behind his ear. "I thought you weren't supposed to bleed, Reshi," Bast said. "Bloodless and all that." "Don't believe everything you hear in stories, Bast. They lie to you." "Well, you aren't nearly as bad off as I thought," Bast said, wiping his hands clean. "Though by all rights you should have lost a piece of your ear. Were they wounded like the one that attacked Carter?" "Not that I could see," Coates said. "How many were there?" "5. "5?" Bast said aghast. "How many did the other fellow kill?" "He distracted one of them for a while," Coates said generously. "Unpowen, Reshi!" Bast said, shaking his head as he threaded a bone needle with something thinner and finer than gut. "You should be dead! You should be dead twice!" Coates shrugged. "It's not the first time I should be dead, Bast. I'm a fair hand at avoiding it." Bast bent to his work. "This will sting a bit," he said, his hands strangely gentle. "Honestly, Reshi, I can't see how you've managed to stay alive this long." Coates shrugged again and closed his eyes. "Neither do I, Bast," he said. His voice was tired and gray. Hours later, the door to Coates' room cracked open and Bast peered inside. Hearing nothing but slow, measured breathing, the young man walked softly to stand beside the bed and bent over the sleeping man. Bast eyed the color of his cheeks, smelled his breath, and lightly touched his forehead, his wrist, and the hollow of his throat above his heart. Then Bast drew a chair alongside the bed and sat, watching his master, listening to him breathe. After a moment, he reached out and brushed the unruly red hair back from his face, like a mother would with a sleeping child. Then he began to sing softly, the tune lilting and strange, almost a lullaby. "How odd to watch a mortal kindle, then to dwindle day by day, knowing their bright souls are tinder, and the wind will have its way. Would I could my own fire lend, what does your flickering portend?" Bast's voice faded until at last he sat motionless, watching the rise and fall of his master's silent breathing through the long hours of morning's early dark. Chapter 6. The Price of Remembering. It was early evening of the next day before Chronicler came down the stairs to the common room of the Waystone Inn. Pale and unsteady, he carried his flat leather satchel under one arm. Coates sat behind the bar, paging through a book. "Ah, our unintentional guest. How's the head?" Chronicler raised a hand to touch the back of his head. "Thrubs a bit when I move around too quickly, but it's still working." "Glad to hear it," Coates said. "Is this—" Chronicler hesitated, looking around. "Are we in Nowar?" Coates nodded. "You are, in fact, in the middle of Nowar." He made a dramatic sweeping gesture with one hand. "Thriving metropolis, home to dozens." Chronicler stared at the red-haired man behind the bar. He leaned against one of the tables for support. "God's charred body," he said breathlessly. "It really is you, isn't it?" The innkeeper looked puzzled. "I beg your pardon?" "I know you're going to deny it," Chronicler said. "But what I saw last night—" The innkeeper held up a hand, quieting him. "Before we discuss the possibility that you've addled your wits with that crack to the head, tell me, how is the road to Tinue?" "What?" Chronicler asked, irritated. "I wasn't heading to Tinue. I was—" Oh. Well, even aside from last night, the road's been pretty rough. I was robbed off by Abbotsford, and I've been on foot ever since. But it was all worth it since you're actually here. The scribe glanced at the sword hanging over the bar and drew a deep breath. His expression became vaguely anxious. I'm not here to cause trouble, mind you. I'm not here because of the price on your head. He gave a weak smile. Not that I could hope to trouble you. Fine. The innkeeper interrupted as he pulled out a white linen cloth and began to polish the bar. Who are you, then? You can call me Chronicler. I didn't ask what I could call you, Coate said. What is your name? Devon. Devon Lockhees. Coate stopped polishing the bar and looked up. Lockhees? Are you related to Duke? Coate trailed off, nodding to himself. Yes, of course you are. Not a chronicler. The chronicler. He stared hard at the balding man, looking him up and down. How about that? The great debunker himself. Chronicler relaxed slightly, obviously pleased to have his reputation precede him. I wasn't trying to be difficult before. I haven't thought of myself as Devon in years. I left that name behind me long ago. He gave the innkeeper a significant look. I expect you know something of that yourself. Coate ignored the unspoken question. I read your book years ago. The Mating Habits of the Common Dracus. Quite the eye-opener for a young man with his head full of stories. Looking down, he began to move the white cloth along the grain of the bar again. I'll admit, I was disappointed to learn that dragons didn't exist. That's a hard lesson for a boy to learn. Chronicler smiled. Honestly, I was a little disappointed myself. I went looking for a legend and found a lizard. A fascinating lizard, but a lizard just the same. And now you're here, Coate said. Have you come to prove that I don't exist? Chronicler laughed nervously. No, you see, we heard a rumor. We? Coate interrupted. I've been traveling with an old friend of yours, Scarpy. Taken you under his wing, has he? Coate said to himself. How about that? Scarpy's apprentice. More of a colleague, really. Coate nodded, still expressionless. I might have guessed he would be the first to find me. Rumor-mongers, both of you. Chronicler's smile grew sour, and he swallowed the first words that came to his lips. He struggled for a moment to recapture his calm demeanor. So, what can I do for you? Coate set aside the clean linen cloth and gave his best innkeeper's smile. Something to eat or drink? A room for the night? Chronicler hesitated. I have it all right here. Coate gestured expansively behind the bar. Old wine, smooth and pale, honey mead, dark ale, sweet fruit liquor, plum, cherry, green apple, blackberry. Coate pointed out the bottles in turn. Come now, surely you must want something. As he spoke, his smile widened, showing too many teeth for a friendly innkeeper's grin. At the same time, his eyes grew cold and hard and angry. Chronicler dropped his gaze. I thought that... You thought? Coate said derisively, dropping all pretense of a smile. I very much doubt it. Otherwise you might have thought, he bit off the word, of how much danger you were putting me in by coming here. Chronicler's face grew red. I'd heard that Kvothe was fearless, he said hotly. The innkeeper shrugged. Only priests and fools are fearless, and I've never been on the best of terms with God. Chronicler frowned, aware that he was being baited. Listen, he continued calmly. I was extraordinarily careful. No one except Scarpy knew I was coming. I didn't mention you to anyone. I didn't expect to actually find you. Imagine my relief, Coate said sarcastically. Obviously disheartened, Chronicler spoke. I'll be the first to admit that my coming here may have been a mistake. He paused, giving Coate the opportunity to contradict him. Coate didn't. Chronicler gave a small, tight sigh and continued. But what's done is done. Won't you even consider— Coate shook his head. It was a long time ago. Not even 2 years, Chronicler protested. And I'm not what I was, Coate continued without pausing. And what was that, exactly? Kvothe, he said simply, refusing to be drawn any further into an explanation. Now, I am Coate. I tend to my inn. That means beer is 3 shims and a private room costs copper. He began polishing the bar again with a fierce intensity. And as you said, done is done. The stories will take care of themselves. But— Coate looked up, and for a second, Chronicler saw past the anger that lay glittering on the surface of his eyes. For a moment, he saw the pain underneath, raw and bloody, like a wound too deep for healing. Then Coate looked away, and only the anger remained. What could you possibly offer me that is worth the price of remembering? Everyone thinks you're dead. You don't get it, do you? Coate shook his head, stuck between amusement and exasperation. That's the whole point. People don't look for you when you're dead. Old enemies don't try to settle scores. People don't come asking you for stories, he said acidly. Chronicler refused to back down. Other people say you're a myth. I am a myth, Coate said easily, making an extravagant gesture. A very special kind of myth that creates itself. The best lies about me are the ones I told. They say you never existed, Chronicler corrected gently. Coate shrugged nonchalantly, his smile fading an imperceptible amount. Sensing weakness, Chronicler continued. Some stories paint you as little more than a red-handed killer. I'm that too. Coate turned to polish the counter behind the bar. He shrugged again, not as easily as before. I've killed men and things that were more than men. Every one of them deserved it. Chronicler shook his head slowly. The stories are saying assassin, not hero. Kvothe the Arcane and Kvothe Kingkiller are 2 very different men. Coate stopped polishing the bar and turned his back to the room. He nodded once without looking up. Some are even saying that there is a new Chandrian, a fresh terror in the night, his hair as red as the blood he spills. The important people know the difference, Coate said, as if he were trying to convince himself, but his voice was weary and despairing, without conviction. Chronicler gave a small laugh. Certainly, for now. But you, of all people, should realize how thin the line is between the truth and a compelling lie, between history and an entertaining story. Chronicler gave his words a minute to sink in. You know which will win, given time. Coate remained facing the back wall, hands flat on the counter. His head was bowed slightly, as if a great weight had settled onto him. He did not speak. Chronicler took an eager step forward, sensing victory. Some people say there was a woman. What do they know? Coate's voice cut like a saw through bone. What do they know about what happened? He spoke so softly that Chronicler had to hold his breath to hear. They say she— Chronicler's words stuck in his suddenly dry throat as the room grew unnaturally quiet. Coate stood with his back to the room, a stillness in his body and a terrible silence clenched between his teeth. His right hand, tangled in a clean white cloth, made a slow fist. 8 inches away, a bottle shattered. The smell of strawberries filled the air alongside the sound of splintering glass. A small noise inside so great a stillness. But it was enough. Enough to break the silence into small, sharp slivers. Chronicler felt himself go cold as he suddenly realized what a dangerous game he was playing. So this is the difference between telling a story and being in one, he thought numbly. The fear. Coat turned. What can any of them know about her? He asked softly. Chronicler's breath stopped when he saw Coat's face. The placid innkeeper's expression was like a shattered mask. Underneath, Coat's expression was haunted. Eyes half in this world, half elsewhere, remembering. Chronicler found himself thinking of a story he had heard, one of the many. The story told of how Kvothe had gone looking for his heart's desire. He had to trick a demon to get it, but once it rested in his hand, he was forced to fight an angel to keep it. I believe it, Chronicler found himself thinking. Before it was just a story, but now I can believe it. This is the face of a man who has killed an angel. What can any of them know about me? Coat demanded, a numb anger in his voice. What can they know about any of this? He made a short, fierce gesture that seemed to take in everything, the broken bottle, the bar, the world. Chronicler swallowed against the dryness of his throat. Only what they're told. Tat, 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 tat. Liquor from the broken bottle began to patter an irregular rhythm onto the floor. Ah! Coat sighed out a long breath. Tat, 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 tat. Clever! You'd use my own best trick against me. You'd hold my story a hostage. I would tell the truth. Nothing but the truth could break me. What is harder than the truth? A sickly, mocking smile flickered across his face. For a long moment, only the gentle tapping of drops against the floor kept the silence at bay. Finally, Coat walked through the doorway behind the bar. Chronicler stood awkwardly in the empty room, unsure whether or not he had been dismissed. A few minutes later, Coat returned with a bucket of soapy water. Without looking in the storyteller's direction, he began to gently, methodically wash his bottles. One at a time, Coat wiped their bottoms clean of the strawberry wine and set them on the bar between himself and Chronicler, as if they might defend him. So you went looking for a myth and found a man, he said without inflection, without looking up. You've heard the stories and now you want the truth of things. Radiating relief, Chronicler set his satchel down on one of the tables, surprised at the slight tremor in his hands. We got wind of you a while back, just a whisper of a rumor. I didn't really expect... Chronicler paused, suddenly awkward. I thought you would be older. I am, Coat said. Chronicler looked puzzled, but before he could say anything, the innkeeper continued. What brings you into this worthless little corner of the world? An appointment with the Earl of Baden-Bright, Chronicler said, puffing himself up slightly. 3 days from now in Treya. The innkeeper paused mid-polish. You expect to make it to the Earl's manor in 4 days? He asked quietly. I am behind schedule, Chronicler admitted. My horse was stolen near Abbotsford. He glanced out the window at the darkening sky. But I'm willing to lose some sleep. I'll be off in the morning and out of your hair. Well, I wouldn't want to cost you any sleep, Coat said sarcastically, his eyes gone hard again. I can tell the whole thing in one breath. He cleared his throat. I trooped, traveled, loved, lost, trusted, and was betrayed. Write that down and burn it for all the good it will do you. You needn't take it that way, Chronicler said quickly. We can take the whole night if you like, and a few hours in the morning as well. How gracious, Coat snapped. You'll have me tell my story in an evening, with no time to collect myself, no time to prepare? His mouth made a thin line. No. Go dally with your Earl. I'll have none of it. Chronicler spoke quickly. If you're certain you'll need— Yes. Coat set a bottle down hard on the bar. Hard. It's safe to say I'll need more time than that, and you'll get none of it tonight. A real story takes time to prepare. Chronicler frowned nervously and ran his hands through his hair. I could spend tomorrow collecting your story. He trailed off at the sight of Coat shaking his head. After a pause, he started again, almost talking to himself. If I pick up a horse in Baden, I can give you all day tomorrow, most of the night, and a piece of the following day. He rubbed his forehead. I hate riding at night, but— I'll need 3 days, Coat said. I'm quite sure of it. Chronicler blanched. But— the Earl! Coat waved a hand dismissively. No one needs 3 days, Chronicler said firmly. I interviewed Orrin Velsiter. Orrin Velsiter, mind you! He's 80 years old and done 200 years' worth of living. 500 if you count the lies. He sought me out, Chronicler said with particular emphasis. He only took 2 days. That is my offer, the innkeeper said simply. I'll do this properly or not at all. Wait! Chronicler brightened suddenly. I've been thinking about this all backward, he said, shaking his head at his own foolishness. I'll just visit the Earl, then come back. You can have all the time you like then. I could even bring Scarpy back with me. Coat gave Chronicler a look of profound disdain. What gives you the slightest impression that I would be here when you came back? He asked incredulously. For that matter, what makes you think you are free to simply walk out of here knowing what you know? Chronicler went very still. He swallowed and started again. Are you saying that— The story will take 3 days, Coat interrupted, starting tomorrow. That is what I am saying. Chronicler closed his eyes and ran his hand over his face. The Earl would be furious, of course. No telling what it might take to get back in his good graces. Still— If that's the only way I can get it, I accept. I'm glad to hear it. The innkeeper relaxed into a half-smile. Come now, is 3 days really so unusual? Chronicler's serious expression returned. 3 days is quite unusual. But then again— Some of the self-importance seemed to leak out of him. Then again— He made a gesture as if to show how useless words were. You are Kvothe. The man who called himself Coat looked up from behind his bottles. A full-lipped smile played about his mouth. A spark was kindling behind his eyes. He seemed taller. Yes, I suppose I am, Kvothe said, and his voice had iron in it. Chapter 7. Of Beginnings and the Names of Things. Sunlight poured into the Waystone. It was a cool, fresh light, fitted for beginnings. It brushed past the miller as he set his water wheel turning for the day. It lit the forge the smith was rekindling after 4 days of cold metal work. It touched draft horses hitched to wagons and sickle blades glittering sharp and ready at the beginning of an autumn day. Inside the Waystone, the light fell across Chronicler's face and touched a beginning there, a blank page waiting the first words of a story. The light flowed across the bar, scattered 1,000 tiny rainbow beginnings from the colored bottles, and climbed the wall toward the sword as if searching for one final beginning. But when the light touched the sword, there were no beginnings to be seen. In fact, the light the sword reflected was dull, burnished, and ages old. Looking at it, Chronicler remembered that though it was the beginning of a day, it was also late autumn and growing colder. The sword shone with the knowledge that dawn was a small beginning compared to the ending of a season, the ending of a year. Chronicler pulled his eyes away from the sword, aware that Kvothe had said something, but not knowing what. "I beg your pardon? How do people normally go about relating their stories?" Kvothe asked. Chronicler shrugged. "Most simply tell me what they remember. Later, I record events in the proper order, remove the unnecessary pieces, clarify, simplify, that sort of thing." Kvothe frowned. "I don't think that will do." Chronicler gave him a shy smile. "Storytellers are always different. They prefer their stories to be left alone, but they also prefer an attentive audience. I usually listen and record later. I have a nearly perfect memory." "Nearly perfect doesn't quite suit me." Kvothe pressed a finger against his lips. "How fast can you write?" Chronicler gave a knowing smile. "Faster than a man can talk." Kvothe raised an eyebrow. "I'd like to see that." Chronicler opened his satchel. He brought out a stack of fine, white paper and a bottle of ink. After arranging them carefully, he dipped a pen and looked expectantly at Kvothe. Kvothe sat forward in his chair and spoke quickly. "I am, we are, she is, he was, they will be." Chronicler's pen danced and scratched down the page as Kvothe watched it. "I, Chronicler, do hereby avow that I can neither read nor write, supine, irreverent, jackdaw, quartz, liqueur, agoliant, lin tach lusoren here. There was a young widow from Phaeton whose morals were hard as a rock. She went to confession for her true obsession." Kvothe leaned farther forward to watch as Chronicler wrote. "Interesting. Oh, you may stop." Chronicler smiled again and wiped his pen on a piece of cloth. The page in front of him held a single line of incomprehensible symbols. "Some sort of cipher?" Kvothe wondered aloud. "Very neatly done, too. I'll bet you don't spoil many pages." He turned the sheet to look at the writing more carefully. "I never spoil pages," Chronicler said haughtily. Kvothe nodded without looking up. "What does egoliant mean?" Chronicler asked. "Oh, nothing. I made it up. I wanted to see if an unfamiliar word would slow you down." He stretched and pulled his chair closer to Chronicler's. "As soon as you show me how to read this, we can begin." Chronicler looked doubtful. "It's a very complex—" Seeing Kvothe's frown, he sighed. "I'll try." Chronicler drew a deep breath and began to write a line of symbols as he spoke. "There are around 50 different sounds we use to speak. I've given each of them a symbol consisting of 1 or 2 pen strokes. It's all sound. I could conceivably transcribe a language I don't even understand." He pointed. "These are different vowel sounds." "All vertical lines," Kvothe said, looking intently at the page. Chronicler paused, thrown off his stride. "Well, yes." "The consonants would be horizontal, then? And they would combine like this?" Taking the pen, Kvothe made a few marks of his own on the page. "Clever. You'd never need more than 2 or 3 for a word." Chronicler watched Kvothe quietly. Kvothe didn't notice. His attention was on the paper. "If this is am, then these must be the ah sounds." He motioned to a group of characters Chronicler had penned. "Ah, a, ow. That would make these the O's." Kvothe nodded to himself and pressed the pen back into Chronicler's hand. "Show me the consonants." Chronicler penned them down numbly, reciting the sounds as he wrote. After a moment, Kvothe took the pen and completed the list himself, asking the dumbfounded Chronicler to correct him if he made a mistake. Chronicler watched and listened as Kvothe completed the list. From beginning to end, the whole process took about 15 minutes. He made no mistakes. "Wonderfully efficient system," Kvothe said appreciatively. "Very logical. Did you design it yourself?" Chronicler took a long moment before he spoke, staring at the rows of characters on the page in front of Kvothe. Finally, disregarding Kvothe's question, Chronicler asked. Did you really learn Tima in a day? Kvothe gave a faint smile and looked down at the table. That's an old story. I'd almost forgotten. It took a day and a half, actually. A day and a half with no sleep. Why do you ask? I heard about it at the university. I never really believed it. He looked down at the page of his cipher in Kvothe's neat handwriting. All of it? Kvothe looked puzzled. What? Did you learn the whole language? No, of course not, Kvothe said rather testily. Only a portion of it. A large portion, to be sure, but I don't believe you can ever learn all of anything, let alone a language. Kvothe rubbed his hands together. Now, are you ready? Chronicler shook his head as if to clear it, set out a new sheet of paper, and nodded. Kvothe held up a hand to keep Chronicler from writing, and spoke. I've never told this story before, and I doubt I'll ever tell it again. Kvothe leaned forward in his chair. Before we begin, you must remember that I am of the Idima Rue. We were telling stories before Kalaptena burned, before there were books to write in, before there was music to play. When the first fire kindled, we Rue were there spinning stories in the circle of its flickering light. Kvothe nodded to the scribe. I know your reputation as a great collector of stories and recorder of events. Kvothe's eyes became hard as flint, sharp as broken glass. That said, do not presume to change a word of what I say. If I seem to wander, if I seem to stray, remember that true stories seldom take the straightest way. Chronicler nodded solemnly, trying to imagine the mind that could break apart his cipher in a piece of an hour, a mind that could learn a language in a day. Kvothe gave a gentle smile and looked around the room as if fixing it in his memory. Chronicler dipped his pen, and Kvothe looked down at his folded hands for as long as it takes to draw 3 deep breaths. Then he began to speak. In some ways, it began when I heard her singing, her voice twinning, mixing with my own. Her voice was like a portrait of her soul, wild as a fire, sharp as shattered glass, sweet and clean as clover. Kvothe shook his head. No. It began at the university. I went to learn magic of the sort they talk about in stories. Magic like Taborlin the Great. I wanted to learn the name of the wind. I wanted fire and lightning. I wanted answers to 10,000 questions and access to their archives. But what I found at the university was much different than a story, and I was much dismayed. But I expect the true beginning lies in what led me to the university. Unexpected fires at twilight. A man with eyes like ice at the bottom of a well. The smell of blood and burning hair. The Chandrian. He nodded to himself. Yes, I suppose that is where it all begins. This is, in many ways, a story about the Chandrian. Kvothe shook his head, as if to free himself from some dark thought. But I suppose I must go even further back than that. If this is to be something resembling my book of deeds, I can spare the time. It will be worth it if I am remembered, if not flatteringly, then at least with some small account of accuracy. But what would my father say if he heard me telling a story this way? Begin at the beginning. Very well. If we are to have a telling, let's make it a proper one. Kvothe sat forward in his chair. In the beginning, as far as I know, the world was spun out of the nameless void by Aleph, who gave everything a name. Or, depending on the version of the tale, found the names all things already possessed. Chronicler let slip a small laugh, though he did not look up from his page or pause in his writing. Kvothe continued, smiling himself. I see you laugh. Very well. For simplicity's sake, let us assume I am the center of creation. In doing this, let us pass over innumerable boring stories, the rise and fall of empires, sagas of heroism, ballads of tragic love. Let us hurry forward to the only tale of any real importance. His smile broadened. mine. My name is Kvothe, pronounced nearly the same as Quoth. Names are important as they tell you a great deal about a person. I've had more names than anyone has a right to. The Adem call me Maedra, which, depending on how it's spoken, can mean the flame, the thunder, or the broken tree. The flame is obvious if you've ever seen me. I have red hair, bright. If I had been born a couple 100 years ago, I would probably have been burned as a demon. I keep it short, but it's unruly. When left to its own devices, it sticks up and makes me look as if I have been set afire. The thunder I attribute to a strong baritone and a great deal of stage training at an early age. I've never thought of the broken tree as very significant, although in retrospect, I suppose it could be considered at least partially prophetic. My first mentor called me Elir, because I was clever, and I knew it. My first real lover called me Dulator, because she liked the sound of it. I have been called Shadikar, Lightfinger, and Six-String. I have been called Kvothe the Bloodless, Kvothe the Arcane, and Kvothe Kingkiller. I have earned those names, bought and paid for them. But I was brought up as Kvothe. My father once told me it meant to know. I have of course been called many other things, most of them uncouth, although very few were unearned. I have stolen princesses back from sleeping barrow kings. I've burned down the town of Treban. I have spent the night with Felurian and left with both my sanity and my life. I was expelled from the university at a younger age than most people are allowed in. I tread paths by moonlight that others fear to speak of during day. I have talked to gods, loved women, and written songs that make the minstrels weep. You may have heard of me. Chapter 8. Thieves, Heretics, and Whores. If this story is to be something resembling my book of deeds, we must begin at the beginning, at the heart of who I truly am. To do this, you must remember that before I was anything else, I was one of the Edema Ruh. Contrary to popular belief, not all traveling performers are of the Ruh. My troupe was not some poor batch of mummers japing at crossroads for pennies, singing for our suppers. We were court performers, Lord Greyfallow's men. Our arrival in most towns was more of an event than the midwinter pageantry and Solonade games rolled together. There were usually at least 8 wagons in our troupe and well over 24 performers, actors and acrobats, musicians and hand magicians, jugglers and jesters. My family. My father was a better actor and musician than any you have ever seen. My mother had a natural gift for words. They were both beautiful, with dark hair and easy laughter. They were Ruh down to their bones, and that, really, is all that needs to be said. Save perhaps that my mother was a noble before she was a trooper. She told me that my father had lured her away from a miserable, dreary hell with sweet music and sweeter words. I could only assume she meant 3 Crossings, where we went to visit relatives when I was very young. Once. My parents were never really married, by which I mean they never bothered making their relationship official with any church. I'm not embarrassed by the fact. They considered themselves married and didn't see much point in announcing it to any government or God. I respect that. In truth, they seemed more content and faithful than many officially married couples I have seen since. Our patron was Baron Greyfallow, and his name opened many doors that would ordinarily be closed to the Edema Ruh. In return, we wore his colors, green and gray, and added to his reputation wherever we went. Once a year we spent 2 span at his manor, entertaining him and his household. It was a happy childhood, growing up in the center of an endless fair. My father would read to me from the great monologues during the long wagon rides between towns. Reciting mostly from memory, his voice would roll down the road for a 1/4 mile. I remember reading along, coming in on the secondary parts. My father would encourage me to try particularly good sections myself, and I learned to love the feel of good words. My mother and I would make up songs together. Other times, my parents would act out romantic dialogues while I followed along in the books. They seemed like games at the time. Little did I know how cunningly I was being taught. I was a curious child, quick with questions and eager to learn. With acrobats and actors as my teachers, it is little wonder that I never grew to dread lessons as most children do. The roads were safer in those days, but cautious folk would still travel with our troop for safety's sake. They supplemented my education. I learned an eclectic smattering of Commonwealth law from a traveling barrister too drunk or too pompous to realize he was lecturing an 8-year-old. I learned woodcraft from a huntsman named Lacklith, who traveled with us for nearly a whole season. I learned the sordid inner workings of the royal court in Modeg from a courtesan. As my father used to say, call a jack, call a spade, but always call a whore a lady. Their lives are hard enough, and it never hurts to be polite. Hetera smelled vaguely of cinnamon, and at 9 years old I found her fascinating without exactly knowing why. She taught me I should never do anything in private that I didn't want talked about in public, and cautioned me not to talk in my sleep. And then there was Abinthy, my first real teacher. He taught me more than all the others set end to end. If not for him, I would never have become the man I am today. I ask that you not hold it against him. He meant well.
You'll have to move along, the mayor said. Camp outside town and no one will bother you so long as you don't start any fights or wander off with anything that isn't yours.
He gave my father a significant look.
Then be on your merry way tomorrow. No performances. They're more trouble than they're worth.
We are licensed, my father said, pulling out a folded piece of parchment from the inner pocket of his jacket. Charged to perform, in fact. The mayor shook his head and made no motion to look at our writ of patronage.
It makes folks rowdy, he said firmly. Last time there was an unholy row during the play. Too much drinking, too much excitement. Folks tore the doors off the public house and smashed up the tables. The hall belongs to the town, you see. The town bears the expense of the repairs.
By this time, our wagons were drawing attention. Trip was doing some juggling. Marion and his wife were putting on an impromptu string puppet show. I was watching my father from the back of our wagon.
We certainly would not want to offend you or your patron, the mayor said. However, the town can ill afford another evening such as that. As a gesture of goodwill, I'm willing to offer you a copper each, say 20 pennies, simply to be on your way and not make any trouble for us here.
Now, you have to understand that 20 pennies might be a good bit of money for some little ragamuffin troupe living hand to mouth, but for us it was simply insulting. He should have offered us 40 to play for the evening, free use of the public hall, a good meal, and beds at the inn. The last we would graciously decline, as their beds were no doubt lousy and those in our wagons were not. If my father was surprised or insulted, he did not show it.
"Pack up!"
he shouted over one shoulder. Trip tucked his juggling stones into various pockets without so much as a flourish. There was a disappointed chorus from several dozen townsfolk as the puppets stopped mid-jape and were packed away. The mayor looked relieved, brought out his purse, and pulled out 2 silver pennies. "I'll be sure to tell the Baron of your generosity," my father said carefully as the mayor laid the pennies into his hand. The mayor froze mid-motion.
"Baron?"
"Baron Greyfallow." My father paused, looking for some spark of recognition on the mayor's face. "Lord of the Eastern Marshes, Whodumbren by Theron and the Wide-Cont Hills." My father looked around at the horizon. "We are still in the Wide-Cont Hills, aren't we?"
"Well, yes," the mayor said. "But Squire Semlin—"
"Oh, we're in Semlin's fief," my father exclaimed, looking around as if now just getting his bearings. "Thin gentleman, tidy little beard." He brushed his chin with his fingers. The mayor nodded numbly. "Charming fellow, lovely singing voice. Met him when we were entertaining the Baron last midwinter."
"Of course." The mayor paused significantly. "Might I see your writ?"
I watched as the mayor read it. It took him a little while, as my father had not bothered to mention the majority of the Baron's titles, such as the Viscount of Montrone and Lord of Trelliston. The upshot was this. It was true that Squire Semlin controlled this little town and all the land around it, but Semlin owed fealty directly to Greyfallow. In more concrete terms, Greyfallow was captain of the ship. Semlin scrubbed the planking and saluted him. The mayor refolded the parchment and handed it back to my father.
"I see."
That was all. I remember being stunned when the mayor didn't apologize or offer my father more money. My father paused as well, then continued. "The city is your jurisdiction, sir, but we'll perform either way. It will either be here or just outside the city limits."
"You can't use the public house," the mayor said firmly. "I won't have it wrecked again."
"We can play right here." My father pointed to the market square. "It will be enough space, and it keeps everyone right here in town." The mayor hesitated, though I could hardly believe it. We sometimes chose to play on the green because the local buildings weren't big enough. 2 of our wagons were built to become stages for just that eventuality. But in my whole 11 years of memory, I could barely count on both hands the times we'd been forced to play the green. We had never played outside the city limits. But we were spared that. The mayor nodded at last and gestured my father closer. I slipped out the back of the wagon and moved close enough to catch the end of what he said.
"God-fearing folk around here. Nothing vulgar or heretical. We had a double handful of trouble with the last troop that came through here. 2 fights, folks missing their laundry, and one of Branston's daughters got herself in a family way."
I was outraged. I waited for my father to show the mayor the sharp side of his tongue, to explain the difference between mere traveling performers and Edema Rue. We didn't steal. We would never let things get so out of control that a bunch of drunks ruined the hall where we were playing. But my father did nothing of the sort. He just nodded and walked back toward our wagon. He gestured and Trip started juggling again. The puppets re-emerged from their cases. As he came around the wagon, he saw me standing, half hidden, beside the horses. "I'm guessing you heard the whole thing from the look on your face," he said with a wry grin. "Let it go, my boy. He gets full marks for honesty, if not for grace. He just says out loud what other folk keep in the quiet of their hearts. Why do you think I have everyone stay in pairs when we go about our business in bigger towns?" I knew it for the truth. Still, it was a hard pill for a young boy to swallow. 20 pennies? I said scathingly. As if he were offering us charity. That was the hardest part of growing up Edema Rue. We are strangers everywhere. Many folk view us as vagabonds and beggars, while others deem us little more than thieves, heretics, and whores. It's hard to be wrongfully accused, but it's worse when the people looking down on you are clods who have never read a book or traveled more than 20 miles from the place they were born. My father laughed and roughed my hair. "Just pity him, my boy. Tomorrow we'll be on our way, but he'll have to keep his own disagreeable company until the day he dies." "He's an ignorant blatherskate," I said bitterly. He lay a firm hand on my shoulder, letting me know I'd said enough. "This is what comes of getting too close to Aour, I suppose. Tomorrow we'll head south. Greener pastures, kinder folk, prettier women." He cupped an ear toward the wagon and nudged me with his elbow. "I can hear everything you say," my mother called sweetly from inside. My father grinned and winked at me. "So what play are we going to do?" I asked my father. Nothing vulgar, mind you. They're God-fearing folk in these parts. He looked at me.
What would you pick?
I gave it a long moment's thought. I'd play something from the Brightfield cycle. The Forging of the Path or some such. My father made a face.
Not a very good play.
I shrugged. They won't know the difference. Besides, it's chock full of Tehlu, so no one will complain about it being vulgar. I looked up at the sky. I just hope it doesn't rain on us halfway through. My father looked up at the clouds.
It will. Still, there are worse things than playing in the rain.
Like playing in the rain and getting shimmed on the deal? I asked.
The mayor hurried up to us, moving at a fast walk.
There was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, and he was puffing a little bit, as if he'd been running.
I talked it over with a few members of the council, and we decided that it would be quite all right for you to use the public house if you would care to.
My father's body language was perfect. It was perfectly clear he was offended, but far too polite to say anything.
I certainly wouldn't want to put you out.
No. No bother at all. I insist, in fact.
Very well, if you insist.
The mayor smiled and hurried away.
Well, that's a little better.
My father sighed.
No need to tighten our belts yet.
Halfpenny a head, that's right. Anyone without a head gets in free, thank you, sir.
Tripp was working the door, making sure everyone paid to see the play.
Halfpenny a head, though, by the rosy glow in your lady's cheeks, I should be charging you for a head and a half, not that it's any of my business, mind you.
Tripp had the quickest tongue of anyone in the troupe, which made him the best man for the job of making sure no one tried to fast-talk or bully their way inside. Wearing his green and gray jester's motley, Tripp could say just about anything and get away with it.
Hello, Mum, no charge for the little one, but if he starts to squawk, you'd best give him the tit quick or take him outside.
Tripp carried on his unending patter.
That's right, halfpenny. Yes, sir, empty head still pays full price.
Though it was always fun to watch Tripp work, most of my attention was on a wagon that had rolled into the other end of town about a quarter hour ago. The mayor had argued with the old man driving it, then stormed off. Now, I saw the mayor heading back to the wagon, accompanied by a tall fellow carrying a long cudgel, the constable, unless I missed my guess. My curiosity got the best of me, and I made my way toward the wagon, doing my best to stay out of sight. The mayor and the old man were arguing again by the time I got close enough to hear. The constable stood nearby, looking irritated and anxious.
Told you, I don't have a license. I don't need a license. Does a peddler need a license? Does a tinker need a license? You're not a tinker, the mayor said. Don't try to pass yourself off as one. I'm not trying to pass myself off as anything, the old man snapped. I'm a tinker and a peddler, and I'm more than both. I'm an arcanist, you great dithering heap of idiot. My point exactly, the mayor said doggedly. We're God-fearing people in these parts. We don't want any meddling with dark things, better left alone. We don't want the trouble your kind can bring.
My kind, the old man said. What do you know about my kind? There probably hasn't been an arcanist through these parts in 50 years.
We like it that way. Just turn around and go back the way you came.
Like hell if I'm spending a night in the rain because of your thick head, the man said hotly. I don't need your permission to rent a room or to do business in the street. Now get away from me, or I'll show you firsthand what sort of trouble my kind can be. Fear flashed across the mayor's face before it was overwhelmed by outrage. He gestured over one shoulder at the constable.
Then you'll spend the night in jail for vagrancy and threatening behavior. We'll let you on your way in the morning if you've learned to keep a civil tongue in your head.
The constable advanced on the wagon, his cudgel held cautiously at his side. The old man stood his ground and raised one hand. A deep red light welled up from the front corners of his wagon.
That's far enough, he said ominously. Things could get ugly otherwise.
After a moment's surprise, I realized the strange light came from a pair of sympathy lamps the old man had mounted on his wagon. I had seen one before in Lord Greyfellow's library. They were brighter than gaslight, steadier than candles or lamps, and lasted nearly forever. They were also terribly expensive. I was willing to bet that no one in this little town had ever heard of them, let alone seen one. The constable stopped in his tracks when the light began to swell, but when nothing else seemed to happen, he set his jaw and kept walking toward the wagon. The old man's expression grew anxious.
"Now hold on a moment,"
he said as the red light from the wagon started to fade.
"We don't want—" "Shut your clapper, you old shitfire," the constable said.
He snatched at the arcanist's arm as if he were sticking his hand into an oven. Then, when nothing happened, he smiled and grew more confident.
"Don't think I won't knock you a good one to keep you from working any more of your devilry." "Well done, Tom," the mayor said, radiating relief. "Bring him along and we'll send someone back for the wagon."
The constable grinned and twisted the old man's arm. The arcanist bent at the waist and gasped a short, painful breath. From where I hid, I saw the arcanist's face change from anxious to pained to angry all in a second. I saw his mouth move. A furious gust of wind came out of nowhere, as if a storm had suddenly burst with no warning. The wind struck the old man's wagon and it tipped onto 2 wheels before slamming back down onto 4. The constable staggered and fell as if he'd been struck by the hand of God. Even where I hid nearly 30 feet away, the wind was so strong that I was forced to take a step forward, as if I'd been pushed roughly from behind.
"Begone!" the old man shouted angrily. "Trouble me no longer. I will set fire to your blood and fill you with a fear like ice and iron."
There was something familiar about his words, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Both the mayor and the constable turned tail and ran, their eyes white and wild as startled horses. The wind faded as quickly as it had come. The whole sudden burst couldn't have lasted more than 5 seconds. As most of the townsfolk were gathered around the public house, I doubted anyone had seen it except for me, the mayor, the constable, and the old man's donkeys who stood placidly in their harness, utterly unperturbed.
"Leave this place clean of your foul presence," the arcanist muttered to himself as he watched them go. "By the power of my name, I command it to be so."
I finally realized why his words seemed so familiar. He was quoting lines from the exorcism scene of Dionica. Not many folk knew that play. The old man turned back to his wagon and began to extemporize. "I'll turn you into butter on a summer day. I'll turn you into a poet with the soul of a priest. I'll fill you with lemon custard and push you out a window." He spat. "Bastards!" His irritation seemed to leave him, and he heaved a great, weary sigh.
"Well, that couldn't have gone much worse,"
the old man muttered as he rubbed at the shoulder of the arm the constable had twisted.
"Do you think they'll come back with a mob behind them?"
For a second, I thought the old man was talking to me. Then I realized the truth. He was talking to his donkeys.
"I don't think so either," he said to them. "But I've been wrong before. Let's stay near the edge of town and have a look at the last of the oats, shall we?"
He clambered up into the back of the wagon and came down with a wide bucket and a nearly empty burlap sack. He upended the sack into the bucket and seemed disheartened by the results. He took out a handful for himself before nudging the bucket toward the donkeys with his foot.
"Don't give me that look," he said to them. "It's short rations all around. Besides, you can graze."
He petted one donkey while he ate his handful of rough oats, stopping occasionally to spit out a husk. It struck me as very sad. This old man all alone on the road with no one to talk to but his donkeys. It's hard for us Idemaru, but at least we had each other. This man had no one.
"We've wandered too far from civilization, boys. The folk that need me don't trust me, and the ones that trust me can't afford me."
The old man peered into his purse.
We've got a penny and a half, so our options are limited. Do we want to be wet tonight or hungry tomorrow? We're not going to do any business, so it will probably be one or the other.
I slunk around the edge of the building until I could see what was written on the side of the old man's wagon. It read, Abinthy, Arcanist Extraordinary, Scribe, Dowser, Chemist, Dentist, Rare Goods, all ailments tended, lost items found, anything mended, no horoscopes, no love potions, no malefaction. Abinthy noticed me as soon as I stepped out from behind the building where I'd been hiding.
Hello there. Can I help you?
You've misspelled ailments, I pointed out. He looked surprised.
It's a joke, actually, he explained. I brew a bit.
Oh, ale, I said, nodding. I get it. I brought my hand out of my pocket. Can you sell me anything for a penny? He seemed stuck between amusement and curiosity.
What are you looking for?
I'd like some Lycilium. We had performed Fairy and the Fair a dozen times in the last month, and it had filled my young mind with intrigue and assassination.
Are you expecting someone to poison you? He said, somewhat taken aback.
Not really, but it seems to me that if you wait around until you know you need an antidote, it's probably too late to pick one up.
I suppose I could sell you a penny's worth, he said. That would be about a dose for a person your size. But it's dangerous stuff in its own right. It only cures certain poisons. You can hurt yourself if you take it at the wrong time.
Oh, I said. I didn't know that. In the play, it was touted as an infallible cure-all. Abinthy tapped his lips thoughtfully.
Can you answer me a question in the meantime?
I nodded.
Whose troupe is that?
In a way, it's mine, I said. But in another way, it's my father's because he runs the show and points which way the wagons go. But it's Baron Greyfallow's too because he's our patron. We're Lord Greyfallow's men. The old man gave me an amused look.
I've heard of you. Good troupe. Good reputation.
I nodded, not seeing any point in false modesty.
Do you think your father might be interested in taking on any help? He asked. I don't claim to be much of an actor, but I'm handy to have around. I could make you face paint and rouge that aren't all full of lead and mercury and arsenic. I can do lights, too, quick, clean, and bright. Different colors if you want them.
I didn't have to think too hard about it. Candles were expensive and vulnerable to drafts. Torches were dirty and dangerous, and everyone in the troupe learned the dangers of cosmetics at an early age. It was hard to become an old seasoned trooper when you painted poison on yourself every third day and ended up raving mad by the time you were 25. I may be overstepping myself a little, I said as I held out my hand for him to shake, but let me be the first to welcome you to the troupe. If this is to be a full and honest account of my life and deeds, I feel I should mention that my reasons for inviting Ben into our troupe were not entirely altruistic. It's true that quality cosmetics and clean lights were a welcome addition to our troupe. It's also true that I'd felt sorry for the old man alone on the road. But underneath it all, I was moved by my curiosity. I had seen Abinthy do something I could not explain. Something strange and wonderful. Not his trick with the sympathy lamps. I recognized that for what it was. Showmanship. A bluff to impress ignorant townsfolk. What he had done afterward was different. He called the wind, and the wind came. It was magic. Real magic. The sort of magic I'd heard about in stories of Taborlin the Great. The sort of magic I hadn't believed in since I was 6. Now, I didn't know what to believe. So I invited him into our troupe, hoping to find answers to my questions. Though I didn't know it at the time, I was looking for the name of the wind. Chapter 9. Riding the Wagon with Ben. Abinthy was the first arcanist I ever met. a strange, exciting figure to a young boy. He was knowledgeable in all the sciences: botany, astronomy, psychology, anatomy, alchemy, geology, chemistry. He was portly, with twinkling eyes that moved quickly from one thing to another. He had a strip of dark gray hair running around the back of his head, but, and this is what I remember most about him, no eyebrows. Rather, he had them, but they were in a perpetual state of regrowing from being burned off in the course of his alchemical pursuits. It made him look surprised and quizzical all at once. He spoke gently, laughed often, and never exercised his wit at the expense of others. He cursed like a drunken sailor with a broken leg, but only at his donkeys. They were called Alpha and Beta, and Abinthy fed them carrots and lumps of sugar when he thought no one was looking. Chemistry was his particular love, and my father said he'd never known a man to run a better still. By his second day in our troop, I was making a habit of riding in his wagon. I would ask him questions, and he would answer. Then he would ask for songs, and I would pluck them out for him on a lute I borrowed from my father's wagon. He would even sing from time to time. He had a bright, reckless tenor that was always wandering off, looking for notes in the wrong places. More often than not, he stopped and laughed at himself when it happened. He was a good man, and there was no conceit in him. Not long after he joined our troop, I asked Abinthy what it was like being an arcanist. He gave me a thoughtful look. "Have you ever known an arcanist?" "We paid one to mend a cracked axle on the road once." I paused to think. "He was heading inland with a caravan of fish." Abinthy made a dismissive gesture. No, boy. I'm talking about arcanists, not some poor chill charmer who works his way back and forth across caravan routes, trying to keep fresh meat from rotting." "What's the difference?" I asked, sensing it was expected of me. "Well," he said, "that might take a bit of explaining." "I've got nothing but time." Abinthy gave me an appraising look. I'd been waiting for it. It was the look that said, "You don't sound as young as you look." I'd hoped he'd come to grips with it fairly soon. It gets tiresome being spoken to as if you are a child, even if you happen to be one. He took a deep breath. "Just because someone knows a trick or two doesn't mean they're an arcanist. They might know how to set a bone or read Eld Vintic. Maybe they even know a little sympathy, but—" "Sympathy?" I interrupted as politely as possible. "You'd probably call it magic," Abinthy said reluctantly. "It's not, really." He shrugged. "But even knowing sympathy doesn't make you an arcanist. A true arcanist has worked his way through the arcanum at the university." At his mention of the arcanum, I bristled with 24 new questions. Not so many, you might think, but when you added them to the 100 questions I carried with me wherever I went, I was stretched nearly to bursting. Only through a severe effort of will did I remain silent, waiting for Abinthy to continue on his own. Abinthy, however, noticed my reaction. "So, you've heard about the arcanum, have you?" He seemed amused. "Tell me what you've heard, then." This small prompt was all the excuse I needed. "I heard from a boy in Temper Glen that if your arm's cut off, they can sew it back on at the university. Can they really? Some stories say Taborlin the Great went there to learn the names of all things. There's a library with 1,000 books. Are there really that many?" He answered the last question, the others having rushed by too quickly for him to respond. "More than 1,000, actually. 10 times 10,000 books. More than that. More books than you could ever read." Abinthy's voice grew vaguely wistful. More books than I could read? Somehow I doubted that. Ben continued. "The people you see riding with caravans, charmers who keep food from spoiling, dowsers, fortune-tellers, toad-eaters, aren't real arcanists any more than all traveling performers are a Dimaru. They might know a little alchemy, a little sympathy, a little medicine." He shook his head. "But they're not arcanists."
A lot of people pretend to be. They wear robes and put on airs to take advantage of the ignorant and gullible. But here's how you tell a true arcanist."
Abinthy pulled a fine chain over his head and handed it to me. It was the first time I had ever seen an Arcanum Gilder. It looked rather unimpressive, just a flat piece of lead with some unfamiliar writing stamped onto it.
"That is a true Giltha, or Gilder if you prefer," Abinthy explained with some satisfaction. "It's the only sure way to be certain of who is and who isn't an arcanist. Your father asked to see mine before he let me ride with your troop. It shows he's a man of the world." He watched me with a sly disinterest. "Uncomfortable, isn't it?"
I gritted my teeth and nodded. My hand had gone numb as soon as I'd touched it. I was curious to study the markings on its front and back, but after the space of 2 breaths, my arm was numb to the shoulder, as if I had slept on it all night. I wondered if my whole body would go numb if I held it long enough. I was prevented from finding out as the wagon hit a bump and my numbed hand almost let Abinthy's Gilder fall to the footboard of the wagon. He snatched it up and slipped it back over his head, chuckling. "How can you stand it?" I asked, trying to rub a little feeling back into my hand. "It only feels that way to other people," he explained. "To its owner, it's just warm. That's how you can tell the difference between an arcanist and someone who has a knack for finding water or guessing at the weather." "Trip has something like that," I said. "He rolls 7s.
"That's a little different," Abinthy laughed. "Not anything so unexplainable as a knack." He slouched a little farther down into his seat. "Probably for the best. A couple 100 years ago, a person was good as dead if folks saw he had a knack. The Talons called them demon signs and burned folk if they had them."
Abinthy's mood seemed to have taken a downward turn. "We had to break Trip out of jail once or twice," I said, trying to lighten the tone of the conversation. "But no one actually tried to burn him." Abinthy gave a tired smile.
"I suspect Trip has a pair of clever dice or an equally clever skill which probably extends to cards as well. I thank you for your timely warning, but a knack is something else entirely."
I can't abide being patronized. "Trip can't cheat to save his life," I said a little more sharply than I had intended. "And anyone in the troop can tell good dice from bad. Trip throws 7s. It doesn't matter whose dice he uses, he rolls 7s. If he bets on someone, they roll 7s. If he so much as bumps a table with loose dice on it, 7.
Abinthy nodded to himself. "My apologies. That does sound like a knack. I'd be curious to see it."
I nodded. "Take your own dice. We haven't let him play for years." A thought occurred to me. It might not still work. He shrugged.
"Knacks don't go away so easily as that. When I was growing up in Staup, I knew a young man with a knack, uncommonly good with plants."
Abinthy's grin was gone as he looked off at something I couldn't see.
"His tomatoes would be red while everyone else's vines were still climbing. His squash were bigger and sweeter. His grapes didn't hardly have to be bottled before they started being wine."
He trailed off, his eyes far away. "Did they burn him?" I asked, with the morbid curiosity of the young.
"What? No, of course not. I'm not that old."
He scowled at me in mock severity.
"There was a drought and he got run out of town. His poor mother was heartbroken."
There was a moment of silence. 2 wagons ahead of us, I heard Taryn and Shandy rehearsing lines from The Swineherd and the Nightingale. Abinthy seemed to be listening as well in an offhand way. After Taryn got himself lost halfway through Fane's Garden monologue, I turned back to face him. "Do they teach acting at the university?" I asked. Abinthy shook his head, slightly amused by the question.
"Many things, but not that."
I looked over at Abinthy and saw him watching me. His eyes danced. "Could you teach me some of those other things?" I asked. He smiled, and it was as easy as that. Abinthy proceeded to give me a brief overview of each of the sciences. While his main love was for chemistry, he believed in a rounded education. I learned how to work the sextant, the compass, the slipstick, the abacus. More important, I learned to do without. Within a span, I could identify any chemical in his cart. In 2 months, I could distill liquor until it was too strong to drink, bandage a wound, set a bone, and diagnose hundreds of sicknesses from symptoms. I knew the process for making 4 different aphrodisiacs, 3 concoctions for contraception, 9 for impotence, and 2 filters referred to simply as Maiden's Helper. Abinthy was rather vague about the purpose of the last of these, but I had some strong suspicions. I learned the formulae for 12 poisons and acids, and 100 medicines and cure-alls, some of which even worked. I doubled my herb lore in theory, if not in practice. Abinthy started to call me Red, and I called him Ben, first in retaliation, then in friendship. Only now, far after the fact, do I recognize how carefully Ben prepared me for what was to come at the university. He did it subtly, once or twice a day, mixed in with my normal lectures. Ben would present me with a little mental exercise I would have to master before we went on to anything else. He made me play Tyranny without a board, keeping track of the stones in my head. Other times, he would stop in the middle of a conversation and make me repeat everything said in the last few minutes, word for word. This was levels beyond the simple memorization I had practiced for the stage. My mind was learning to work in different ways, becoming stronger. It felt the same way your body feels after a day of splitting wood, or swimming, or sex. You feel exhausted, languorous, and almost godlike. This feeling was similar, except it was my intellect that was weary and expanded, languid and latently powerful. I could feel my mind starting to awaken. I seemed to gain momentum as I progressed, like when water starts to wash away a dam made of sand. I don't know if you understand what a geometric progression is, but that is the best way to describe it. Through it all, Ben continued to teach me mental exercises that I was half convinced he constructed out of sheer meanness. Chapter 10. Aylar and Several Stones. Ben held up a chunk of dirty fieldstone slightly bigger than his fist. "What will happen if I let go of this rock?" I thought for a bit. Simple questions during lesson time were very seldom simple. Finally, I gave the obvious answer. "It will probably fall." He raised an eyebrow. I had kept him busy over the last several months, and he hadn't had the leisure to accidentally burn them off. "Probably? You sound like a sophist, boy. Hasn't it always fallen before?" I stuck my tongue out at him. "Don't try to boldface your way through this one. That's a fallacy. You taught me that yourself." He grinned. "Fine. Would it be fair to say you believe it will fall?" "Fair enough. I want you to believe it will fall up when I let go of it." His grin widened. I tried. It was like doing mental gymnastics. After a while, I nodded. "Okay." "How well do you believe it?" "Not very well," I admitted. "I want you to believe this rock will float away. Believe it with a faith that will move mountains and shake trees." He paused and seemed to take a different tack. "Do you believe in God?" "Telu?" "After a fashion." "Not good enough." "Do you believe in your parents?" I gave a little smile. "Sometimes. I can't see them right now." He snorted and unhooked the slapstick he used to goad Alpha and Beta when they were being lazy. "Do you believe in this, Alir?" He only called me Alir when he thought I was being especially willfully obstinate. He held out the stick for my inspection. There was a malicious glitter in his eye. I decided not to tempt fate. "Yes." "Good. He slapped the side of the wagon with it, producing a sharp crack. One of Alpha's ears pivoted around at the noise, uncertain as to whether or not it was directed at her. "That's the sort of belief I want. It's called